labor prices for tree fruit through the roof. I think Washington is going to be almost $20 an hour this coming year. So that's one of the major drivers of costs for the growers. That coupled with low commodity prices has just
Right.
been really tough for them. And so they're looking to economize as much as they can. And um, if they can do that through squeaking by with less hives per acre.
From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and people like you who are making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Andony Malathopoulos, Associate Professor of Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. Okay, Harry, it is that time for our commercial beekeeping segment. Tell us a little bit about our guest this week.
Oh, we have a great guest this week, Tim Hiatt from Ephrata, Washington. Oh, and many, many other locations across the northern United States. And Tim has a lot of very powerful things to say about working in our agricultural system, in our agricultural community, in a very united, balanced, and thoughtful way. It's just been a pleasure to talk with Tim.
Yeah, I was really impressed. There's a couple things in the interview that stood out in my mind. He was talking about, some of the challenges in the tree fruit industry with low commodity prices on the horizon, but also how some of the growers, and I was really amazed when he talked about this, innovatively doing these double sets and, in a way that he was comfortable with, taking advantage of the elevation to be able to sort of maximize their pollination returns. I thought it was really, really amazing.
Yes, that was new to me. But what isn't new to me is his attitude in working in a cooperative manner, whether that be with his growers, his fellow beekeepers, pesticide applicators, the legislature. For us to move ahead, he sets a good example of working in a very understanding and united way in our agricultural community.
So commendable. It was really great to hear him talk about all sides of the issue and trying to find common ground for everybody. It's a really great episode.
All right, well, let's get to it.
Let's head up to Washington this week on Pollination. Hi, Tim. Welcome to Pollination.
Hello. Glad to be here.
So, Tim, I've seen since 1979, you started about 10 years before I did. You've built an amazing and very successful beekeeping operation. And was just hoping maybe you could give us just a little bit of insight on how it all got started and brought you to where you are today.
Well, I didn't start it. I'm a second generation beekeeper. My folks were school teachers, and my dad worked for a beekeeper in the summertime in Eastern Oregon. And he enjoyed it so much that he wanted to go full time. So he got a small loan and moved from the Ontario area up to Eastern Washington and bought a small beekeeper up here. And then my brothers and I were all born, and we all had something to do after school every day and all summer. So yeah, that was in 68 when my folks got started into bees.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then in, I think my first full-time year was 91, but I'd been working in the bees since I was probably 12. And then my brothers, as they grew up, came in and joined, and 5 of us so far are all keeping bees together.
That's awesome. So, excuse me, you have a whole lifetime of experience before I got started, it sounds like.
Okay.
I'm kind of curious, Tim. I've run into other beekeeping operations with siblings, and sort of like sometimes it works out that somebody specializes on one part of the operation, and sometimes it's just like kind of the tasks are divvied out kind of evenly. How does it work in your operation?
Well, there's 5 of us full-time, and we each kind of do what we enjoy. So me, I'm kind of the finance and legal and budgeting side of things. I just finished with the 2024 books and got those off to the CPA. We're recording this here in late January. And another brother likes to talk on the phone. And so he's on the phone with drivers arranging transportation and with honey buyers. And he takes care of a lot of that. And another brother handles the California pollination thing. And another brother is responsible for the honey production in the Dakotas for the summer. So we kind of divvy up our responsibilities that way. And then I know of a lot of farming operations that have tried to be a family operation that haven't succeeded because, sometimes you don't get along with your family members that much. And one thing that helps us is I have one brother here in Washington with me for the winter, and three brothers go to California for the winter. So we have some natural time apart, and that really helps.
Great. Well, your bees are well on their way or mainly there now in California for almonds. And
Yeah, we winter in California. We're kind of slow on the uptake on the whole indoor wintering thing. So we winter in California, and so my brothers are putting many almonds now.
well, that was a good decision because we've had great weather, but it's rain's on the way and snow, it looks like.
And
So
there's
then
already some bloom. So yeah,
that's
they
what
need
I've
to be
heard.
in.
It's early,
Yes,
it's a week early. Yeah,
it is. I'm just looking at a beekeeper Facebook page with pictures of a bee on an almond blossom today.
scary.
So
Well, then it's just a blink of an eye, and I know that you are up in the tree fruits heavy with your bees, and so that's the next big thing. I read your article in the Capital Press, a little bit of trepidation in the industry. Thought maybe you could enlighten us a little bit about.
right. As we know, the almond pollination thing is just huge for beekeeping in the US. There's some huge percentage of the bees in the nation go to California for almond pollination. But the same's not true in the Pacific Northwest. It's a huge deal, the pollination in the Pacific Northwest. In fact, I'm up in Eastern Washington, and the National Ag Statistics Service data has Washington as the number 2 state in the nation for acres under pollination. And if you cut almonds out of California, Washington actually jumps to number 1. There's slightly more acres under pollination in Washington than in California outside of almonds. So definitely there's not enough bees in Washington to service the need here. I'm not sure about Oregon, but here we totally rely on out of state bees. Even the beekeepers who live in Washington all year still go to California for the almonds. So tree fruit, berries, seed crops here in Washington definitely depend on the movement of honeybees to supply their needs.
And so, in that statistics report, were tree fruits the predominant crop, or is it a
Yes, apples were by far the leading crop in the Pacific Northwest in terms of acres under pollination. And then cherries and pears were also huge. Actually, there is no report from NAS on that. I went into NAS and dug up all the data myself and put it together in a graph. So
very
that's
nice?
my right. I should probably talk to some undergrad at Washington State or Oregon State and have them actually do a more rigorous look at that question. But those are my numbers, at least, and I'm sticking to them. So
Well, you have me curious as far as the percentages in Oregon because maybe at Donny, do you know? Because I would guess our seed pollination would be our largest amount of pollinating hives in Oregon.
Yeah, I should have those figures. Blueberry is sucks up a lot of colonies as well, but our apple industry is tiny, and the cherry and pear is not nearly the size of Washington. So tree fruits in Washington are king. It is a big difference between our two states. There is seed production in the Skagit Valley, but not nearly, the extent of the Willamette Valley, and then the carrot seed pollination that we have in Eastern Oregon doesn't exist, I don't believe, in Washington.
the which
So
the which seed?
Oh, carrot seed.
Carrot seed. Yeah, in Eastern Washington, there is carrot seed and onion seed. May not amount to a ton of acres, but yeah, I've pollinated both of those before.
We have about 1,800, or I'm sorry, we have about 18,000 hives in carrot seed in Oregon. At least that's the last figure I saw. And that, no, I'm sorry, in the Madras area. I know that we also have additional carrot seed in Eastern Oregon.
That's a bunch. That's probably more than here for sure.
Well, the tree
So
fruits are an oddity for us. And some we have pear and cherry, but the acres of apples and apples just seem like a strange fruit to pollinate because of the need to get a good strong pollination on the king bloom, but then then you don't want the bloom to extend. It seems like a tricky pollination to pull off.
It really is, yes. Over the years, we've seen all kinds of crazy pollination seasons. Sometimes we've had bees and apples for 3.5 weeks. And our record is 1 day as
Really?
the shortest pollination we've ever had. It was up in Orondo, right on the Columbia River. And one night we brought them in and the temperature was in the 80s the next day. And then that next night, the grower said, well, I'm done with them. Come and get them when you want.
wow, that's a record, Tim.
That was, they couldn't be any shorter than that. Nowadays, though, with the diversification that's needed for growers to maximize their labor, they try to plant crops that stagger their blooms, stagger their pick, so that they don't have to have a gigantic 100-person crew in 1 week to pick all their crops. Instead, they can have a 20 or 30-person crew, and they finish one variety to pick, and then they move on to the next variety because on the calendar, the different varieties come off at different times. And that works to the beekeeper's advantage because the bloom often is somewhat staggered. Some varieties bloom earlier than others. And then cherries and pears, of course, have their own schedule. And, where I am in Eastern Washington, sometimes pears bloom after the apples. Sometimes they bloom before. Depends on the weather because they progress at different temperatures. The apples seem to me to progress at an even 60 degrees or so, but then pears are different. And so it often messes us up and then we have mountain valleys that we're bringing bees to and north facing sides of the valleys versus south facing sides. And so it throws off the timing pretty good. So yeah, it's a huge confusing mess. And I'm not in charge of that. One of my brothers is on the phone with those growers trying to arrange everything, and all we can do really is work with our growers and ask them to give us as much notice as they can. And if they can give us a couple days, then we'll be able to get them in on the day they want. And the same coming out, if they can give us a couple days notice coming out, that makes it possible for us to do it the way they would like it, rather than having to give them the bad news that, sorry, we've had other people call and you're going to have to wait. And then, like you say, we're pollinating side bloom and they don't want that.
Does having a tree fruit focus kind of exclude you from blueberries? Do you have to do one or the other, or can you do both?
The west side blueberries is kind of a big thing. There's quite a bit of acres there. And they really wouldn't interfere with our tree fruit on the east side, but I just have no interest in it because of the problems with European foulbrood that have popped up so much in the berries. And they drag on pretty long, the berries do. We want to get our bees back from the tree fruit, start going through them, feeding, checking queens, getting those populations built up and queen right and everything before summer comes. And we start shipping bees out to honey production at the end of May. And that makes it kind of tight to get through everything between the end of when berries stop blooming and the beginning of honey production.
Talking about all of these different crops, it brings me back to the Capital Press article. You had the notion that some growers were getting a little conservative on their hive rentals, possibly due to some issues. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. The cost to the grower are just increasing every year, and revenue is not coming up, especially in tree fruit. We're a partner in a small apple orchard, and I see the inside of the books on the tree fruit side as an owner, and it's just terrible. Costs are going crazy. The H2A program, which provides beekeepers with lots of good workers from out of the country, is also driving labor prices for tree fruit through the roof. I think Washington is going to be almost $20 an hour this coming year. So that's one of the major drivers of costs for the growers. That coupled with low commodity prices has just
Right.
been really tough for them. And so they're looking to economize as much as they can. And um, if they can do that through squeaking by with less hives per acre. Another technique they're using is they will get bees from me and then they'll move those bees themselves between
Ooh,
orchards. I have growers that have acreages in different areas. I have a grower that has acreage in Rock Island, Washington, and then up on the other side of Wenatchee at Monitor, and then further up the valley toward the Shasta and Dryden. And there's enough elevation change and distance change between those different locations that they operate that they can move their own bees. So we'll drop them off at the lowest elevation location, and we'll pick them up at the highest elevation location, and they've economized hugely. I have another grower that has a very large orchard. He gets over 1,000 hives, and they would get more, but they're able to take the bees from their orchards right on the river to their orchards that are only 3/4 of a mile away, but it's also up 1,000 feet up into the hills above the Columbia River. So, and I've worked with them to make sure that they're not harming the bees, gone back and looked at the locations that they moved out of to make sure that the workers are all finding their way back to their new homes, and they are. So they're saving quite a bit of money by double setting those hives themselves or placing them twice for two complete sets of pollinations for the same grower.
that's a very interesting partnership tactic that's the first I've heard of that.
Yeah, some of these huge orchards and take advantage of that geological oddity of distance between blocks and um, elevation changes to really save themselves a bunch of money. But that means
Nice.
they have to handle those hives themselves. So they learn to be careful.
Yeah, real quick.
They sure do.
So you mentioned labor, and I know down in our orchards, I do a lot of apples and cherries in the valley here. Picking labor has been really tough for a number of years down here. And what do you see both there and in bee operation your size isn't going to be done by two or three people. You need a lot of help. And how have you seen it change?
Well, I've been in the bees long enough to remember the days when high school kids wanted to work in the summertime.
Right.
My first years as a full-time beekeeper, my dad said, "Okay, you go to North Dakota. I'll send you the bees and you put them out." And I was kind of hesitant because I didn't really know all the locations very well and had never done anything like that before. But what really saved me was I got there and school had just got out for the summer, and a couple kids that had worked the previous summer came out to work again. And they showed me the locations and were super helpful. Now we just can't find local folks to work. It's been really hard. So we rely on the H-2A visa program. We bring in folks from Mexico and Nicaragua, and they're all beekeepers. They have experience from their home country. It's been a very good experience for us on average. There's been a few bad apples in the bin, a few guys who didn't work out, but the majority are super appreciative of the opportunity we give them. We've got guys who would come and at the end of their first year, they saved enough to go home and build themselves a small house to live in.
Yay.
That's how much they make, you know.
Nice.
So they are very appreciative and very much are interested in coming back for us. We've had the same guys for years and years and years. The majority have come back for us. I think the oldest guy working for us, has been working for us since, well, the 90s. So, yeah, real
Very
good guy.
good.
Yep.
I know in conversation with Canadian beekeepers, their migrant worker program has gotten more difficult, and over a decade they've seen it slow down. How has been the experience in the United States with migrant worker programs?
It's a very complex program, no matter what you do. When we got started in it, I thought it was complex then, and it's more complex now. What saves us, though, are companies that offer their services to shepherd your application through the process. And they provide compliance advice and monitor the paperwork at every point, and they're totally worth it. They do a great job. Years ago, we did used to run in Canada before the border closed, and boy, we made some big crops of honey up there in Alberta. We were in northern Alberta, and I remember being a little kid and watching the sun be up at midnight and thinking, wow, the bees must make big honey up here with so many flying hours. And they did.
Just out of curiosity, Tim, do you remember where you were?
Peace River area.
Oh, great. Awesome.
I think
Yep.
Andony might be familiar with that area.
I
a
lived
little
in
bit.
Beaver Lodge. I'm a Peace River through and through. Anyways,
Well,
thank you.
great. Beautiful area. Wow. Just beautiful.
So do you recall what kind of crops you were pulling up there?
Well, back then it was alfalfa.
Oh,
There wasn't that much canola up there that many years ago. This was the 70s when my dad used to go to Canada. And yeah, mostly alfalfa. At
good
least that's
honey
what I
crops
recall.
and no mites.
Huge honey crops and no mites, right? Yep. I think,
But-
Harry, you and I are the dying breed. I'm not giving up, but I still want my silver bullet for varroa mites. For those of us who remember what it was like, I mean, that's, why settle for this? I'm a big supporter of honeybee research, and so I'm not giving up on the idea of a silver bullet. And all of my scientist friends tell me that's unrealistic, but I don't care. I remember how those bees were before varroa and
Oh, yeah.
before the viruses they spread. And man, beekeeping was such a joy then. Now it's
And it
not so
was,
much.
it spread into the period where we had mites, where we could just knock them down in the fall and you'd have piles of dead mites.
Oh, just remember the Apistan days.
The Apistan days.
Yeah.
You could have
Right.
piles of dead mites in the bottom of the hive, and yet the bees would winter well after you'd removed the mites. But the viruses are the thing now.
Right. They're much more virulent than they used to be, and the economic impact thresholds are getting lower and lower every year.
Right.
I'm almost feeling like if you can see a mite, you've got a problem.
Yeah. And if the mites get to now in 2025 to even a fairly low level compared to a couple years ago, it's too late. The viruses have taken a hold in the hive. They're spread horizontally, and you're in trouble.
Right. So I am taking advantage of the latest research that I can find, with controlling mites and monitoring my mites. I am having low levels for an extended period, and I would have thought that the viruses would have cleared out in a couple generations, but I may not be right about that. And I'm looking down the pike for more research to indicate where where the viruses are going when the mites are low, because I'm controlling the mites better than I ever have. And I'm still seeing unacceptable die-offs.
We are as well. So I wanted to ask you on another subject. I've known for years that you and I kind of hold the same hat, wear the same hat in our state organization as far as the legislative issues and working with them. And what are you seeing as far as governmental issues going on up in Washington and in the Pacific Northwest? For example, here in Oregon now, the thing that we're working on is the electric truck mandate, and trying to work into more of a reasonable unfolding of that project. What big issues do you see up there in Washington?
Well, for us, I keep seeing attacks on our access to farm labor. Right now in the legislature this week, there was a hearing in which legislators are calling for the ability of farm workers to unionize.
Oh, yes.
And um, I don't know how that would work with H-2A labor. That doesn't seem like anyway. And then I think among a large portion of the legislators, there's the belief that all farm workers are slaves and they're mistreated. And I just want to yell at the person and say, "Come and see my guys when they're here working. Come and look at where they live. Come and put on a veil and come with us to the bee yard." And you'll see that I'm out there with them. My brother and I are in the yard with them every day, and we're moving the bees with them, and we all do the same things, and the place they live is nice. And I don't know how we get rid of that perception other than I don't know how you get rid of it. But yeah, labor is a huge concern. Here in Washington, there's a strong environmental awareness contingent in the legislature, and we've tried to partner with them as much as we can. Bees, honeybees, and all pollinators generally supply ecosystem services, and they're very necessary. People's gardens and cities need pollination, and if there's too many parking lots and too much pesticides being applied to the median strips of roads and things, why the native pollinators can suffer. And so those backyard beekeepers play a role in cities. And agriculture depends. In Washington, being the number 2 state in the nation for pollination, we have to have healthy honeybees and other pollinators to service the needs of pollinated agriculture. And the legislature is starting to understand that, and I need to keep working on that message with them. So, yeah, it's a struggle, but generally the legislature's been very supportive of honeybees. I kind of got involved in the legislative side during the big CCD scare of a few years
Yeah.
ago, and there was much interest in our industry and the desire to support, and they have done that. The legislature has. They have done, we've been successful in several areas. I think the latest thing we did was we successfully got uh, a uh, a l- exemption from liability for keeping bees as long as you keep them according to the local zoning rules and you've registered with the state. You're exempt from civil liability.
Wow.
So as long as you're not criminal, you can keep bees in the state. Now, if you happen to be in a town that forbids beekeeping inside city limits, well, you have to abide by that. But if you're in a
Yeah.
town that says you can have 2 hives in your backyard and you have 2 hives in your backyard and somebody gets stung, you're protected from liability for that as long as you register with the state and abide by the zoning laws. And that was well received by the legislature. They did understand that the ecosystem services beekeepers and other pollinators provide are very useful. On the legislative committee right now, one of the members is taking his journeyman class from the Washington State beekeepers, and he also has mason bees at his house. So, there's no reason that native bees and honeybees can't share the same agenda when it comes to presenting forage ideas to the legislature or ideas for improving access to wild lands. Now, that's where we kind of get into trouble with some folks in the legislature because some agencies want to limit honeybee placement on public lands. And the science on that is mixed at best. The state established a pollinator health task force a few years ago. And last year, Dr. Diane Cox Foster from the Logan Bee Lab spoke to the group and explained her 3-year long research project looking at competition between native pollinators and honeybees in their area in the mountains above where they have their lab. And her results were subtle and they were mixed. And yes, there were some ways in which there was a bit of competition between native pollinators and honeybees, and other ways in which they did not have any competition. So rather than having some groups push for a precautionary principle ban on placing honeybees on wild ground or state agency ground, there should be a more nuanced and sophisticated look at that question. And minds are hard to change, though, so we're doing what we can.
I suppose when it comes to being active, as a state association and being in the legislature, it is a kind of interesting ag community because it does have this large urban constituency. In a way that the poultry industry doesn't have the backyard people keeping backyard chickens in the same association. The state association for beekeepers is kind of this unique entity that does bridge both urban and rural concerns.
It really does bridge goals, right? At the state convention, you'll see a handful of commercial guys and then hundreds of hobby beekeepers. And the speakers that come, they'll talk about honeybee health, and it's applicable to everyone. And so I think there's a lot more we have in common, certainly, than we don't have in common. In the past, there have been some friction between the hobbyist side and commercial side. And kind of one of my goals was to try to bridge that gap and to show that honeybee health is all of our concerns and pollinator health generally benefits everyone. So it's an ongoing struggle, you know. People come into beekeeping with their own agendas, whether it's I need to save the bees, save the planet, or I'm interested in these fascinating little creatures that can live in my backyard. And but there's always a place for everyone.
Really, really, you struck a chord there, talking about, you know, wanting to bring some of the legislators out, throw a veil on them, and show them what you do. That's really what kind of Andony and I and a whole bunch of other people in Oregon have been working on, is telling our story and really finding ways to build bridges. We've set up meetings with growers groups where we bring in beekeepers and the growers, and we sit down and we go over a year for that crop from start to finish, and all of the things that come up, possibilities, and everybody leaves the room just shaking their head going, why didn't we do this years ago? And that's something that we're very proud of and we work very hard on.
It does remind me of what Tim was saying, in that oftentimes these hardened positions can be quite softened because they've been built up with a kind of like, one side versus the other, when there's a lot more commonality. And, getting the conversation flowing sometimes can break down where somebody thinks, oh, we're opposed. We actually have, I imagine, even when it comes to native bees and honeybees, there is the common project of increasing forage in Washington. That, this is a kind of a goal that both groups are going to have to work together on if they're going to convince anybody of anything.
That's right. When I first got involved in the legislative stuff, something I heard very commonly from growers or grower advocates was, we don't owe you beekeepers anything for forage. That's your own business. And it's definitely changed. Not that they feel like we should have government programs to provide forage, but they see the benefit of making forage available to beekeepers so that it keeps their costs down. And in turn, the pollination costs don't have to rise so fast. At the last state convention I was at, I was visiting with a woman who said that, well, we don't have to have all these bees. We can just keep them in the state. And I had to explain that we don't have enough forage in the state for the bees required to pollinate the acres we have. Now, if we want to have less acres of apples, we can, but you're not going to be able to afford apples if we do that. Only the wealthy will. And that's not a situation I want. I want to be able to export at low cost fruit and vegetables around the world so people can get nutrition. I don't want to have to charge $1,000 a hive to pollinate this niche crop that only the wealthy can afford on a tiny little bit of acres. I think there's a way to make this work for everybody. And one of the ways in which that works is to bring in bees from out of state. Now, I don't like the carbon footprint that we have by moving these bees between states. And maybe someday soon, the Tesla semi will be affordable. We can move them all moving between states without carbon emissions. That'd be wonderful. But in the meantime, it's necessary for our food supply. So, and like you mentioned, Andony, hardened positions are hard to change. So it was a fun discussion I had with this woman, but it was, I don't know. We'll try to win hearts as we can.
Well, maybe just to round things out, we at the beginning of Harry had the questions directed at the piece in the Capital Press about the changing shape of agriculture in Washington State, the pollination markets, and growers are looking ahead and they're seeing low commodity prices, higher labor costs, and you having much the same kind of challenges. And Harry's questions about mite problems don't. There's the silver bullet doesn't seem to be arriving anytime soon, even though we hope for it. How do you see when you look out, 5-10 years, how things in Washington could play out in a positive way, or what kind of crossroads are we at right now?
Well, with the change of presidential administration, it's really hard to predict the future. I would have thought with this change, we'd be looking at expanded export markets for fruits and vegetables, but we don't know what that's going to be. That would help the revenue side for the growers. For the beekeeper side, well, some folks have been innovating on the mite treatment side, and that is much appreciated. And we're taking advantage of every advance we can find to help control the mites. When we left Washington for the summer, I think our last year here was 78 or 79 was our last year that we kept bees in Washington for the summer. And then since then, we've left every summer because there was too many sprays, pesticides, which aren't the problem now that they were then, and that there just wasn't enough forage. But now I'm seeing in Washington the rise of small beekeepers that have a 500, 1,000, 1,200 hives, and they're able to find forage for their hives. And I think that's a segment of the industry that could probably do with a little more growth, and it probably will as the pollination prices continue to rise and some of these questions of honeybee health get addressed. The person who can make a living off of a fairly small amount of hives may become more common, like it was when I was a kid. When I was young, we moved our bees by hand. We would load semis by hand to go to California for the almonds. And now we have these fancy, nice forklifts that allow a one person to do the hard labor of many that was done in the past. And so the small to mid-sized beekeeper may have a future in Washington going forward. I hope that the studies showing the effectiveness of marginal plantings in orchards continues. I hope that the results of those studies, and maybe even carried out in the Pacific Northwest, can show that if growers will maintain some of those margins and let them go wild, that will have an overall benefit for both native and managed pollinators.
One of the things I've really appreciated, Tim, over the years, seeing you in the news, is your very balanced, thoughtful approach that you put forward with pesticide use. And again, you were talking about, people's, deep-seated feelings about bees can be hard to change. And there's a lot of hardliners in pesticide use. And I see the same thing you see. I know of a person that sent 1,200 hives into an area and they were all killed with pesticide. And we haven't seen that in years and years and years. And that the working together and working towards a win-win with growers and beekeepers, working together on the movements and migratory bees in and out and the pesticide applications. It seems like you and I mirrored each other in our legislators with putting forth more of a win-win attitude for growers and beekeepers. And I just wanted to thank you for that on your side.
Absolutely. It's really the only way to proceed forward. We have to have cooperation and understanding, or we'll just be fighting at cross purposes. And the legislature looks at an industry that's not united, looks at agriculture and says, if you guys have your own difficulties and differences, we don't want to hear it. You go somewhere else and sort this out and come back to us. So we realize we have to be partners with the rest of agriculture and they with us so that we can work together. Emblematic of that cooperation, our latest legislative agenda item is we want to follow Oregon's lead and have a pollinator plate. And so I have a bill submitted to a representative where this week, if everything goes well, we will submit it to the Department of Licensing and introduce the bill later this week, if everything goes well. And the
Amazing.
sponsor, if he accepts, is a pesticide applicator pilot, spray applicator by
Really?
Nice. Yay.
Yeah. He and I have had our differences in the past, but we both realize that cooperation is better than not. And, agriculture is better united than divided.
When it came to the Oregon plate, it was a similar story that, Harry and I and other beekeepers had met with the Oregon Clover Commission and had worked out an arrangement to help colonies do that pollination more safely and recognition of the importance of that seed crop for cover crops across the nation. And the plate really profiles that. We wanted to show how in Oregon when it goes going down the I-5, people can see what a good working relationship between agriculture and both native and managed honeybees could be. Native bees and honeybees could be.
Yeah, that sounds like a great way to go. And that's what we're trying to do here too.
We wish you well on the plate initiative, and thank you for taking time today to just before the beekeeping season gets going in earnest to tell us a little bit about your operation and your experience working with the legislature.
Glad to do it. Good to talk to you both.
Thank you so much for listening. Show notes with links from each episode are available at the website pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's a form at the website where you can pop in and say hello and give me feedback. If you want to support the show, remember to leave a rating on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever podcast mothership you use. And finally, if you have the means and you want to help support my lab's effort to document bee biodiversity in Oregon, visit OregonBeeAtlas.org and follow down to the donate button where you can make a tax-deductible donation to the Jerry and Judith Paul Native Pollinator Endowment. Every little bit helps. See you next episode.